Finally, we have up next our first plenary session delivered by Dr. Justin Lee from Singapore Bible College. Dr. Lee is an associate professor of systematic and historical theology at Singapore Bible College. He's also the associate dean of the School of Theology English and assistant director of the Helix Center, the research wing of SBC. He is trained in historical theology and is currently working on a book on Asian theology. Before SBC, Dr. Lee served in pastoral ministry in the States and the UK, and he currently worships at Bartley Christian Church.
So today he'll be sharing how theological and sociopolitical factors have shaped our understanding of the doctrine of creation here in Singapore, and what issues have arisen because of our history. Please join me in welcoming to the stage Dr. Lee.
Thank you. Let me just say that I have been following what the Our Father's World Group has been doing for a number of years now, since your early days actually. So most of you don't know who I am, but I'm aware of what you guys have been doing for years, and it's really encouraging to see the development, the growth, even the professionalism. So I'm very impressed by the scope and the scale of this conference, and I'm definitely very honored and excited to be here to see the wonderful things that are happening in this creation care space in Singapore. Now, before we get into our talk for today, I feel like I have to introduce myself a bit more than just the introduction that was given. I think in part, in order for you guys to listen to me and to accept that what I'm saying is valid or true, is worth listening to, I think I have to show you my membership card. Or in another way, maybe in the young people language, people might refer to this potentially as aura farming, right? Not doing this kind of thing, but to show you that I am, in some sense, one of you. So let me show you a little bit. For years now, I've actually been going to the nature parks as a regular part of my oftentimes Sunday routine, where maybe after church, I will typically go for a walk in one of the many nature parks. There are a few that I have now frequented for years now. I just wanted to show you a few videos that I have captured of the many over the years. Right, here's one, just a mouse deer, very, very close. I have to say, I have very good luck with finding mouse deer, and they're a lot easier to find now. Next one, maybe. As you guys see, colugos, not too difficult to find. Sometimes you find more than one on a tree. Okay, this one is hard to see, and it's a long video, but I heard a group of wild boar in the park. This was at Lower Pierce, and you can't see them so well in the video, but there are definitely more than 10. Big group. So I actually followed them around to find them, and I ran into them at this one section of the park, which was really cool, because usually you see them in groups of one, maybe a mother with babies, but there are at least 10, maybe around 15. And the last one, I think, is one that you guys might be aware of, which is, this one is tailless. If you guys know the famous crocodile, just basking in shallow water, and I happened to spot it from the tower in Sungai Buloh Wetland Reserve, and I came down to find it, and I happened to discover it just chilling there, and I was like, wow, there's nobody else seeing this except for me. Yeah. So for me, as I've mentioned, this idea of going out on nature walks has become a very normal part of my Sunday routine. I haven't been able to go the last number of weeks because I've been overseas and I've had a slight knee injury, but for me, it's part of my worship routine. I feel that being in nature and absorbing the vibes of creation, right? Enjoying the beauty of creation is part of the natural worship experience as I see the goodness and the beauty of the world that God has made, the very little details that He's put into all of His creation, and enjoying these things, I think, is part of what I like to do, and I think that some of you here as well. So the reason I'm here today, though, is because this is, unfortunately, not always the norm. Among some Christians in Singapore, not all, there is a prevailing attitude of apathy about creation care, or maybe even the created world, or at times even hostility. I'm aware of a study that the Our Father's World team was doing a few years back, and I'm curious about whether or not your data confirms this. But I know that for many of you, your experiences do that generally speaking, when you show an interest in creation, when you tell people that this is something that is part of God's work, maybe even part of mission work, the fact that there are people who resist and say, this is not true, this is not biblical, this is not theological, is an experience that I know many of you here have faced. So what I'm here to do is just to ask the question, why is this the case? What are the factors, historically, theologically, culturally, that shape this attitude towards creation, and how then do we maybe move forward from this? And as I reflected on this topic as I was preparing, I was wondering, why am I giving a plenary on this topic? Because I was looking at some of the other workshops, and I was like, there's a lot of really amazing, exciting-looking workshops that I feel could have been, better in place in some way. But I guess the reason is because this experience is something that is shared well enough that maybe everybody needs to hear a little bit more about this. So what we're asking, oh, wow, the font is smaller, okay. I didn't make it this small. What historical, social, and theological factors have shaped what Christians believe about creation? And second, okay, what about for Singaporean Christians? Well, stuff happens. Okay. So to begin, I want to turn to a very well-known article from 1967, which is Lynn White's The Historical Roots of Our Ecological Crisis. Some of you might be aware of this. It was written in 1967. And in this article, in this essay, Professor Lynn White makes a very influential argument that blame for the modern ecological crisis can be placed largely on anthropocentric attitudes that come from the Christian doctrine of man's creation in the image of God. White uses the example of the development of agricultural technology in the Middle Ages to show that modern man's attitude to the world around him has been fundamentally shaped by a dualism that comes out of Christian human exceptionalism, which in turn shapes modern science and the development of technology. This results in the mandate that God's will is that man exploit nature for his proper ends, which is a quote from White. Can I get the next slide, please? So we have a couple quotes here from White, which the first one, which says, especially in its Western form, Christianity is the most anthropocentric religion in the world has seen. Christianity not only established dualism of man and nature, but also insisted that it is God's will that man exploit nature for his proper ends. Another quote, since both science and technology are blessed words in our contemporary vocabulary, some may be happy at the notions, first, that viewed historically, modern science is an extrapolation of natural theology, and second, that modern technology is at least partly to be explained as an occidental, voluntarist realization of the Christian dogma of man's transcendence of and rightful mastery over nature. So White's arguments about how modern exploitation of nature comes out of Christian doctrine, Christian theology, was a very popular and influential argument. But the question, do White's arguments hold water? Are they true? And next slide. Critics have responded to White, and some of the responses have been, for example, that Genesis 1, where the phrase have dominion appears in verse 28, does not mean domination in the original Hebrew context, but refers more to working the ground and to peaceful governance. Additionally, this is the second point, when viewed as a whole, the Bible does not hold to a single perspective on human relation to the natural world, nor do Christians for that matter, and within that, stewardship is a more prevalent theme than domination. Some have pointed to what's more important than the biblical text itself is how people have received it and interpreted it in different contexts, which we will get to shortly. But to round things out, some scholars also argue that the example of the Middle Ages, which White cites, saw the modification of nature as more practical than hostile, that it is difficult to substantiate a religiously motivated ideology of exploitation that comes out of the Middle Ages. So the point should be on the slide here, but if you can work through those. So however we feel about these points on the slide, about White's argument, it is difficult to ignore the influence that his paper had, especially in two ways. First, it was a major factor in kickstarting the modern environmentalist movement. And second, it spawned a number of other studies that have sought to confirm his claim of these generally negative Christian attitude towards nature and the environment, as well as trying to identify what aspects of Christian belief correlate most closely to an anti-environmentalist attitude. So if you look on the screen here, these are some, not all, but a few factors, a few studies, which look at, which take White's claim as a starting point and try to determine what are specific indicators, what are specific beliefs or ideas or attitude that shape a negative attitude towards creation. And they're more than just this. So if the Bible itself doesn't explicitly teach domination, and the medieval worldview is not to blame, then where do negative or exploitative attitudes towards creation come from? And how is Christianity intertwined with these ideas? Well, in history, there are two identifiable events or periods that help us to understand these anti-environmentalist attitudes, but also the ecological crisis generally, and I think many of you are aware of these. These two events are the scientific revolution in the 16th and 17th centuries, and the Industrial Revolution, which started mostly in the 18th century, especially in England at the time. Historians usually mark the beginning of the scientific revolution as Copernicus' discovery of a heliocentric solar system, which represented a revolution in scientific knowledge which would challenge and even overthrow the infallible authority of the church. Other significant discoveries include Newton and gravity, Galileo and the solar system, Kepler and planetary orbits, to name just a few, or even Francis Bacon and the scientific method. However, important to this discussion today is the ways in which the scientific revolution shifted how people viewed the natural world. No longer was the world seen as a divine and supernatural entity, but it became more soulless and inert. That to understand the natural world was to engage in rational analysis to determine its objective properties. For example, in a book called Man in the Natural World, Changing Attitudes in England, 1500 to 1800, Keith Thomas observed that the prevailing belief in Tudor and Stuart England, which is the 1400s to the 1700s, give or take, was that nature existed solely to serve man's interests, that every creature was made in the service of man, and that obnoxious insects and fierce wild animals only exist because of the fall. So we see his quote here. René Descartes, philosopher and scientist, speaks of science allowing humans to become masters and possessors of nature in order to live well in the world and to enjoy its fruits. Similarly, Francis Bacon, citing Genesis 1:28, says, "For man, by the fall, lost at once his state of innocence and empire over creation, both of which can be partially recovered even in this life, the first by religion and faith, the second by the arts and sciences," or as Bacon says elsewhere, "Man, if we look to final causes, may be regarded as the center of the world, insomuch that if man were taken away from the world, the rest would seem to be all astray without aim or purpose." Now, the thing about both Descartes and Bacon is that they were both practicing Christians. We should recognize, however, that in context, neither is proclaiming the right to exploit nature. This is something that would come later. Instead, they are appealing to man's innate authority over the created world, both because of man's rationality as well as the ability to manipulate it, but also because this was God's given right to the human race. More significant was the Industrial Revolution, which began in the 1700s in Europe, but mostly in England. As technology developed, for example, the cotton gin, the steam engine, factories, dynamite, electricity, etc., humans found themselves able to further bend nature to their will. The natural world became, to industrialists, natural resources to be exploited and collected, and land as real estate to be owned and sold. In fact, the natural world was seen in this time by many as a hostile force to be conquered for the good of humankind. In the United States, this was seen most obviously in the attitude of manifest destiny, which is the next picture. The belief that it was God's will for man to expand and develop American civilization, which was obviously greater than the other cultures that existed in that place. One very well-known photo in the next slide of this is this mountain of buffalo skulls, right? The American bison, which were hunted mercilessly and without good reason, with the meat and the hides oftentimes left behind when the native peoples of that region subsisted on these American bison, using every single bit, but those who hunted them purely for the sake of sport and no other reason. We see similar attitudes in the European project of colonialism, in which new lands are discovered and claimed. Natives are viewed as inferior and therefore subjugated. Resources are extracted, and people are bought and sold, the modern slave trade, all in the name of empire, progress, and civilization. All the while, the Bible was used to justify these endeavors. Such work was viewed as a divine right. So progress itself in this time was viewed as intrinsically good, whether technological or economic progress, despite the cost that it had on society. And the results did show, right? Lifespans increased in this era in Europe. The development of modern medicine increased health outcomes for many, preventing many treatable illnesses, and increased working wages brought many out of poverty. But as we know, this also created great environmental and social damage, pollution, exploitation of the working class, etc., that still continues today, especially in developing countries. Now, there were, of course, people in these times who opposed the errors and the problems that they saw, many of whom were Christians too. For example, we know Christians were very key in the abolition of slavery, both in England and in North America, in the United States, as well as things like care for the poor and the needy. But we can see how in this era, a broadly Christian society can be shaped by larger social and economic forces that can twist the message of the Bible to support causes like dominion and exploitation. So I think these stories are ones that many of us are quite familiar with, these periods and how they shape Christian thought and belief, or just broadly capitalism and other exploitative forces. But are there other theological and spiritual events or factors that help shape Christian belief? And the answer is, yes, there are. Now, one of the important factors that I want to talk about are the revivals of the 1700s and the 1800s, what are called the First and the Second Great Awakenings. Now, the first one that you see on the screen here was a time in which a culturally Christian but spiritually dry UK, as well as the United States, experienced revivals through the open-air preaching of figures like John Wesley, George Whitefield, and Jonathan Edwards. At the time, there was a very strong emphasis on head religion, but in turn, people like Wesley and others focused on the heart religion, warming of the heart, and the personal decision to follow Christ, as well as the dangers of hell. Some of you might be familiar with Jonathan Edwards' famous sermon, Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God, in which he paints the image of a spider or an insect dangling over the fires of God's wrath of hell, and how you simply need to believe in Christ in order to escape this fate that is before you. The Second Great Awakening was a related revival movement that took place in the 1800s, primarily on the American frontier, often in the context of tent revivals. One illustration of the spirit of these revivals can be seen in what's called the anxious bench, which was a tool used to push hearers into making a decision for Christ. So the way that it was used is that the bench was placed towards the front of the space, and people who were feeling anxious about what they're hearing, who weren't sure what to do and felt a need to be prayed for, would go up to the front and were then encouraged to make a decision for Christ. Now, my point here is not to critique these revival events, as they were clearly used to bring many people to Christ. In fact, many of us can claim our Christian heritage from these movements. Methodists in particular come out of this First Great Awakening movement. But this characteristic, this part of evangelicalism's heritage, what we call conversionism, to use the language of David Bebbington, is part of what we are seeing going on here. There's oftentimes here an overemphasis on the soul and the conversion moment, resulting often in an implicit heaven and earth or a soul-body dualism, as well as a sense of escapism that is into heaven that leaves little place for God's redemption of all of creation. As Howard Snyder puts it, this worldview emptied the earth of its divine significance and robbed heaven of its full biblical meaning and eschatological promise. You see, in the Bible, heaven is never viewed as the final destination for humans. This is a modern invention, but the legacy of this type of thinking, of emphasis on the soul at the expense of the body, emphasis on heaven at the expense of creation and the world, continues onwards into the 20th century and into the 21st century in the preaching ministry of Billy Graham and others who continue this revivalist spirit. Now again, I'm not trying to say that this is all bad. Okay? I'm not trying to make figures like Wesley or Edwards or others look bad, or I'm not critiquing their doctrines of creation. Edwards had a great deal to say about slavery and opposed it quite firmly. Wesley was a very strong advocate of the poor, but both Both were aware of social issues in their times and linked these to the gospel and to Christian living, to gospel witness. But given that these were people of their times, it's hard for us to assume as modern people that they would have the same ideas about the environment, the same ideas about creation, that they would have the same concerns as we do now in the way that we do, given that these were not pressing issues for them. So we have to be fair in trying to assess them and not view them anachronistically. Now, of all of the various factors, I think probably the most significant factor that has shaped Christian attitudes towards the environment and the natural world is the rise of what is called dispensationalism. Oh, sorry. Okay, there's one more quote. The revivals, this is from, again, from, what's his name? Snyder, I think. The revivals of the 1800s that accompanied America's expanding frontier were thus filled with paradox and ambiguity. God's Spirit brought vital faith to the masses, yet the narrative was flawed. The vision of God's redemptive plan suffered many of the maladies of medieval Christendom, including a worldview that emptied the earth of its divine significance and robbed heaven of its full biblical meaning and eschatological promise. Okay, I read some of this. So I think dispensationalism is probably one of the most significant factors that shapes the way that people think about creation. And if you don't know anything about this movement, I'll give you a very brief introduction. Two factors that you might know are John Nelson Darby, who lived from 1800 to 1882, a Plymouth Brethren, who is widely credited as a founder of this movement, as well as the Scofield Bible, which made this movement especially popular in the United States, where it spread. So dispensationalism begins in the 1800s in England. It was not as successful there, but it spread eventually to the United States, and it became popular due to Bible conferences, the formation of institutions like Dallas Seminary and Talbot, which is where I was trained, as well as this Scofield Reference Bible, which some of you, the older folks here, might be familiar with, which is essentially a study Bible with distinctively dispensational commentary and cross-references. Now, what are the major beliefs of this dispensational movement? Well, for one, there's a very strong literal interpretation of Scripture, especially Revelation, as being something that will take place in the far future, or the near future. Number two, dividing up of the Bible and history and God's saving work into different periods or dispensations, which is why this, where this movement gets its name. An often pessimistic attitude about the state of the world, believing that the world would get worse and worse until the return of Christ. One thing to note about the era in which dispensationalism develops is that it was an era of overall optimism, right? Science and technology were on the rise. Things looked like they would get better. And the actual popular view in this era was what we call post-millennialism. And one of the characters of post-millennialism is that it believes that the world will continue to improve and improve, and the gospel will go forth into the nations, and the world will see a golden era until Christ finally returns. But this very quickly broke. And if you think about things in context, you might know why. Events like America's Civil War, World War I, and World War II exposed people to the great danger, the great harm that human technology and progress could have when these things were used for non-godly ends, for evil ends. So characterized by this more pessimistic attitude of the world, dispensationalism taught that things would continue to get worse in the world until Christ would return, and became popular, at least in part because of this. Another belief of dispensationalism is the imminence of the end times, that we are living in the end times now, and Christ could return at any point. And one thing that comes out of this belief in imminence is, especially in the 20th century, a lot of people began to look for different factors or events that would usher in the end times. That is, these are the signs that the end times is here and now, and we must recognize that the end is coming now. I'll give you one example. There's a website that I often cite called Rapture Ready. It's still very active now, and these guys who run this website are looking around the world for different factors that they give different ratings from 1 to 5 that will then show how close we are to the end times on a numerical scale. So it goes up and down depending on global events. So this is an attitude of the looking for the signs of the end times. Another unique characteristic of dispensationalism was its teaching on the rapture. That is, that prior to the Great Tribulation, the saints would be taken up into heaven to be joined with Christ, drawing primarily from 1 Thessalonians 4. And this would then be followed by the literal 1,000 reign of the Christ, also known as the millennial kingdom of Revelation 20. But it's important to note that the belief in the literal 1,000 years or premillennial eschatology is not unique to dispensationalism. Now, in case what I've said is too much heavy theological material, and I'm aware that it is, here's a chart which might explain things for you. Okay. In case you want to know, it doesn't, right? In dispensationalism, there are a lot of these types of charts. I forget who the major author, what his name is, that try to explain what the events of the end times will look like in this biblical framework. But to sum things up, dispensationalism is a theological movement that took off, especially in the United States, in the 20th century, after the era of the two world wars. In an era that saw two world wars, a period of depression and continuing tension in the midst of the Cold War, dispensationalism preached the imminence of Christ's return and emphasized current events as marking the end times in a way that confirmed people's fears and uncertainty in that time. So we have to recognize that this dispensational belief does shape a lot of evangelical Christianity, not only in the way that people think of end times, but even in things like the formation of the nation-state of Israel and pro-Israel politics that continue to shape, say, American, but also other, for example, British policy. Now, here's the thing. Most of you do not come from traditionally dispensational churches. If you're brethren, you do. But if you're a Presbyterian, Methodist, Anglican, or whatever else, you likely don't come from a tradition that is dispensationalist. But in the United States, beginning in the 1970s onwards, we have a movement that we call pop dispensationalism. This is using the language of, I forget the author's name, but the slide will come up later, which made popular ideas like the imminent rapture, predicting when Jesus would come, or seeing current events as ushering the end times, in large part because of the uncertainty of the Cold War in this era. So those who are a bit older will know of the book The Late Great Planet Earth by Hal Lindsey, in which he is doing a lot of prophetic interpretation of current events in that time as indicating that Christ is returning. And many of you, even from my age, will have grown up watching things like Left Behind or read the books or know of these things, which are part of this pop dispensationalist movement. All of this stuff, for those who grew up in this time, led to an end times obsession in Christianity that still continues to linger in some circles today, especially if you consumed a lot of this material. And I don't know about you, but when I was growing up, there was a very common fear that you might be left behind in the rapture while everybody else but you is in heaven, right? And so you might be left behind. And so there's countless stories of people waking up, going downstairs, or going and looking around their house, seeing nobody else but themselves, and wondering, have my family all been raptured except for me? This was a common experience for many in this time. Okay, so what does all this have to do with Christian attitudes towards the environment? Well, one thing that dispensationalism does is it popularizes negative and pessimistic attitudes towards creation at large, especially the belief that the world will burn up anyways, to use the language of 2 Peter chapter 3. It is a culmination of the dualistic and soul-centric turn within Christianity that we've already seen, as well as a pessimism and dismissal of the future of the created world. Snyder again comments on this. He says, premillennial dispensationalism popularized the view that the earth and the whole material creation is destined to be destroyed. This makes creation concerns pointless. As Balmer puts it, the evangelical penchant for dispensationalism results in lack of concern for the environment and the natural world. If Jesus is going to return soon to rescue the true believers and to unleash judgment on those left behind, why should we devote any attention whatsoever to the care of the earth, which will soon be destroyed? Consider, for example, how Hal Lindsey interprets 2 Peter 3:10 in the best-selling Late Great Planet Earth. He says this: the word translated as elements is stoicheon, which means the most basic element of nature. Today, we know that atom is the smallest building block of nature. Now, Peter says that these elements will be destroyed. The literal meaning of the word destroyed is to lose something. No wonder there will be great roar and intense heat and fire. Then Christ will put the atoms back together to form a new heaven and earth in which only glorified persons without their sinful nature will live. Now, here's the thing about this interpretation. The Greek word for destroyed which is translated in some Bible translations as burned up, is actually a problematic translation in the manuscript tradition. In his book, in Richard Middleton's book, A New Heaven and a New Earth, which is a very important book on eschatology, if you've never read it and are interested, I highly recommend it. He points out that the word for burned up, which is kata kaesetai on the left side, will be burned up, is actually a text that appears, a word that appears only in the Textus Receptus, or the majority text, and appears in versions, basically the KJV. Whereas the Greek word, hirathesetai, which the new NIV translates as exposed, or the ESV as also exposed, literally means will be found, is found attested in better and more reliable manuscript traditions. So what does this tell us? There's a selective choosing of language that reflects a belief that already exists. So Middleton comments on this. He says, it seems that, aided and abetted by a dualistic worldview which devalued earthly life and assumed a supramundane destiny for the redeemed, translators allow the tenor of judgment in 2 Peter 3 to overwhelm the text and determine their text-critical choices, going against the dictum that the more difficult reading is probably the better one. While the text undoubtedly speaks of judgment and destruction, using the image of a cosmic conflagration, it describes the destruction not of creation but of sin, thus cleansing or purifying creation. So going back to Lynn White and the studies that have built on White's arguments, it's this type of Christianity, shaped by dispensationalism and fundamentalism, with a very strong biblical literalism, especially in reading Revelation, and a very strong focus on end times, that typically has resulted in negative or dismissive views of creation. So if you go back to my earlier slide, I'm not going to go back to it, the factors that the people who have identified that contribute to negative views of creation are usually the ones that are associated with a dispensational type of theology. And if we add to this factors like the anti-science bent in fundamentalist Christianity, the association of environmentalism with liberal politics, especially in the US, and big oil influence on right media, which is true, we can see why it has been normalized in Christianity, at least in the United States, to think that creation is insignificant to the Christian faith and to the doctrine of salvation, and why it is common for Christians to hate on things like creation care. Now, the fact is that as a theological system, dispensationalism has actually declined in the US. Hummel, that's a book I was referring to earlier. As Hummel points out, no scholar of any note today holds to classical dispensationalism, nor any major theological institution. Most of them only hold to a progressive dispensationalism, not a classical one. And for me, coming out of Talbot, which was a progressive dispensationalist school, I can affirm this, at least in my own experience. And if you want to know more about dispensationalism's rise and fall, Hummel's book is an excellent book that talks about this interesting theological movement, which had such an oversized influence on evangelicalism, but Christianity as a whole, especially in the second half of the 20th century. So one thing that I want you guys to realize is that the theological beliefs that we hold are never really taken from an objective interpretation of the Bible, but they're often shaped by various cultural and social forces, oftentimes resulting in reading and interpreting the Bible through particular lenses. So do you realize then, for those of you who are here who are pro-creation care, that it's not only people who are anti-creation care who possess flawed and at times unbiblical views in their theologies based on the Bible, but that we too might hold to ideas and beliefs that are also inherently unbiblical and potentially incorrect or even immoral. All theology is contextual, but I should note as well, though, that despite my negative portrayal of some Christians' attitude towards creation, there have always been Christians in those spaces advocating for better care of creation and the theological significance of creation in the Christian story, in salvation, whether in the scientific or industrial revolutions in the 20th century or even today, but we don't have time to get into those examples. Now, the last thing I want to mention in this paper is the issue of Singapore. What about the Singaporean context? Now, as an outsider, I can testify 100% that this American evangelical, dispensationalist, fundamentalist Christian character that I've been talking about is very strongly present here as well. the Christianity that was planted here, especially in the 1970s onwards, and flourished, still carries with it a very largely American flavor in this kind of way. But what about specifically with the Singapore context? What about how Christians here view creation? Now, on the surface, there's actually a great deal to praise. Ever since the early days of colonialism, Singapore has been recognized and celebrated for its great biodiversity. Many of us know Singapore for being a garden city, especially seen in Lee Kuan Yew's massive tree planting programs in the 1960s and onwards to make Singapore an oasis in Southeast Asia. And in this sense, we have to give great credit to NParks and their efforts for developing and preserving green spaces, like Minister Lee was just showing. Those are amazing things that are going on, of integrating urban spaces and nature, and even creating ecological corridors for the sake of biodiversity. These things are amazing. There are a few countries in the area that are doing these kinds of things, and these are worthy to be praised. However, it's difficult to say that Singapore is an exception to broadly anthropocentric attitudes to the natural world that characterize modern society. The resilience of natural wildlife in Singapore, for example, has only taken place because these species went extinct or nearly extinct in an earlier time, often because of the clearing of forests for agriculture and the pollution of waterways due to urbanization. I'm talking about things like hornbills. I think I heard a hornbill outside as I was coming in, not entirely sure, or the otters, who have become the most well-recognized celebrity in Singapore. The greening of Singapore's spaces, urban spaces, for example, in the URA's A Green and Livable City is very, very well done, as all of us can access. But again, much like Singapore's largely pragmatic character, it clearly has at its heart, first, human flourishing. And I'm not saying this is a bad thing, right? This is a good thing. But biodiversity and ecosystem conservation are mentioned at length in these kinds of documents, and these are good things in NPark's website, for example. But again, these are all with humans at the center. Right? The practical benefits, like the therapeutic benefit of nature, the cooling of the city, the improving of air quality, show that ultimately these things are being done for human concerns first and human flourishing first. So again, I'm not critiquing Singapore as an outsider. I don't want to get in trouble for saying that these are bad things. These are innately good things. But of course, we are all products of the worlds we live in, and we will ultimately have these anthropocentric, man-centric motivations. Now, as an outsider, though, one critique I can make of Singapore is, with regard to creation, is the way that all of you think about land, okay? Land, not money or time, is the most precious commodity in Singapore, because you can have a lot of money, but land will always be in short supply because of the size of this place. It's so small, right? What this means practically is that land will always be commodified in the way that we've been talking about. It will always be thought of as something to be used, a source of profit, rather than something innate, having an innate value, of having a worth in and of itself. Coming from a place in the United States where land is more abundant, it's funny for me to see the comments that people make about an undeveloped plot of land and how much money that could be worth, or landed properties and the desire to have a space that is your own, or even the idea of freehold housing is a foreign idea to me. But it's clear that the market shapes the way that people think. Right? This is a very far cry from the Old Testament, in which the land itself is given Sabbath, or is even seen as a living thing. Consider also indigenous peoples who have a real and historic physical connection to their land. Given that few of such type of people exist in a place like Singapore, can any of us here, myself included, understand perspectives like these? These perspectives are difficult to imagine in Singapore, where most of the land has lost its innate properties and the landscape is consistently changing. Singapore's history is full of the manipulation of land for human good, whether for agriculture, water, nature reserves, or land reclamation. And again, I'm not saying these things are bad, but these things will ultimately shape the way that you view the created world that you live in, sometimes for the worse. So again, I think it's very difficult for Singaporeans, whether you're a Christian or not, whether you are pro-creation care or not, to think about the natural world in this sense as something beyond something to own or to control. And for those who are passionate about the environment and sustainability and creation care here, which I'm guessing is most of you, This is something that we all have to grapple with as we live in society. We are shaped by the forces that are around us. We are products of our times. Now, before I close, there's one last point I want to make that I think is worth mentioning, which is this. Those of you who are younger grew up in a very different generation a different time than those who grew up in the older generations. For example, the older Kampong Singapore was a time of development, industrialization. There was not much time in this era, right, in the era where some of you who are older, when you grew up, to think about things like the environment, which is often the case in many developing countries around us. It's only when things get really bad, where the water is undrinkable or the air is unbreathable, that people begin to talk about these kinds of issues. There was also a lack of awareness in earlier times of the theologies that influenced Christianity then and the innately contextual nature of those theologies as we've been looking at. And again, in the way that people like Wesley and Whitefield were limited in their time, we are also the same way. Here's the thing. Those of you who are of the younger generation, and I say this as a millennial, okay, I'm a millennial, those of you who are in the younger generation grew up in a modern Singapore. You have grown up with plenty. You have grown up with higher standards of living and education. You grew up with privilege. You have the time and the energy to think deeply about the world you live in. You have the tools to identify and analyze the problems that you see in order to address them. You have access to books and perspectives and things that are going on elsewhere in the world. It's a privileged situation. It's a perspective situation. You see, the concern about things like creation, the concern about things like the future, the convictions that many of you have who are here arise because you see the immediacy of your concerns in the world today and how they affect you directly, as well as the generations that will come after you. And it's a bit different from those who are older. You see, because of this, it's difficult for us to say, or difficult for me to say, that you have an innately morally superior view than those who are shaped by the earlier times. You have the ability to think about these things. Your perspective is different. And so, this means that you have the responsibility to show people and to teach them and to walk patiently aside them to guide them in the right way. If I'm honest, Singapore is not a bad place with regard to what we are doing here. The fact that there's all of these initiatives taking place in the government, but also amongst those who are working here, shows that there is actually a lot of good going on and things are going in a good direction. Maybe you want more, but again, sometimes we can be a little bit greedy. The fact that there's a conference like this, the fact that there's a group of young people who are building momentum and drawing crowds of hundreds of people to say, we need to advocate for more integration of environmentally motivated things, sustainability within our churches, is a place of privilege. Because can you imagine, in some of the nearby countries, could you have a conference like this? You can't, because people will not go to that conference. They won't see that it's necessary. It would be very difficult. So there's a lot of potential here. Over time, things will change. In fact, within a generation or two, this might become the norm. You might become the old ones who have outdated views on certain things because you are limited by the perspectives of your own times. But you who are here, especially who are younger, have the ability to lead the church onwards in the future in a better way, in a more biblical way, in a more integrated way. So for those of you who have faced disappointment, who have faced difficulties in trying to advocate for certain causes within your church or other spaces, who have experienced rejection or critique or criticism from oftentimes those of older generation, be patient, be humble, right? Be loving. And for those of you who are older and are here and are advocating for the younger people, God bless you, because you are the ones who make these kinds of spaces happen. So my encouragement to all of you is this. Let's not repeat the mistakes of the past, whether in how we view creation or other important biblical or theological issues. Be aware of our own limitations because we are all shaped by the forces that exist around us. We are not perfect. Our views are not perfect. Our theologies are not perfect. And there will always be ways in which God is encouraging us and urging us onwards to be different, to transform, to reform in ways that are more in accordance with His purposes. Thank you.